you mute your mic, because otherwise we can actually pick up on a lot of background noise and get some feedback in the mic. But you are going to have lots of opportunities to turn your mics on and have a chat this afternoon. So, you know, you're welcome to turn your mic on as well when you'd like to speak. So thanks again for joining me this afternoon for this professional learning. You're all absolute truthers being here. You know, start of term 4, there's so much going on in schools at the moment, I know myself. So, you know, being here this afternoon is just such a wonderful, valued time, and I really want to make sure that this is a time that you can take away a lot from. And it's great to see some of you again. This workshop's following on from that first online workshop on strategies for effective literacy teaching that came all from this book. This publication. Now, if you have ended up in this workshop and you hadn't actually completed the first workshop, hi, I'm Libby. I'm a teacher in the ACT. I ran that first workshop. I work here as a teacher librarian, but I've also worked as an ELAD consultant, as a literacy consultant. I've presented for ALEA and written for publications. So that's kind of where I came from. I ran 10 of the first workshop in this series from the beginning of this year to kind of August. So if you were one of the participants, you probably attended one of those. If you didn't attend that first workshop though, and you're keen to have a look at it, there should be some popping up at the start of next year. So during the session, I will be referring to strategies that were covered in the first workshop. So if you're someone who didn't attend that first one, do feel free to let yourself be known. And also if you have any questions about any of the strategies as we go through, feel free to ask any questions. I'm happy to fill in gaps now, like during the strategies or even at the very end. So there's a little rambled introduction of myself. I know that I've met most of you online, this being the second workshop in the series, but you guys probably haven't met each other. I think it's a really nice thing to do at the start of each of these online workshops to introduce ourselves. You're welcome to do that on the mic or in the group chat. Let us know who you are, where you are, what year you're teaching, and also feel free as well now if you want to share if this is if you didn't attend that first workshop, feel free to share that as well. That way we can have a little bit of an overview of who we've got with us this afternoon. So I'll go quiet for a little bit if people want to use the mic. And just introduce yourselves. Don't be shy.
Hi Libby, it's Robin.
Hi Robin.
Hi, I'm going to go now. I think we're fine. Katarina's on, so
awesome.
That's good. If you hear of anybody else who can't get on, if somebody just emails me, I'll do what I can.
Okay, will do.
But
thanks.
Otherwise, I think we're good. Thanks, Libby. Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Hi Jane, thank you for introducing yourself on the chat. You're in Hobart. And what year levels are you teaching, Jane? Year level. Oh, someone's got lots of lovely feedback there. Oh, Lizzie from Canberra. Okay, you haven't done the first workshop. Well, it's lovely that you can join us this afternoon. Look, if you do have extra questions though, I'm happy to go back and answer those. Oh, so we've got a learning support teacher with us as well. Okay, and you attended the last one, I'm assuming that was a teacher's assistance workshop, Joanne. This one will be focused on teachers in the classroom, but I'm sure that it's all very transferable to where you're working as well. And whereabouts are you, Joanne? Oh, so Annette, you're one of the people who listened online. That's great. I think some people got the recording of the first workshop, so that they were kind of up to date with where we're up to. Oh, great. So you work in EAL or English as an additional language, dialect. Jane? Suzanne is primary teacher, also in ESL, and vocational programs. Oh, wow. So Suzanne, are you in, oh, you are in primary. Brilliant. I can see lots of people introducing themselves. Great. Thank you, everyone, for introducing some new people to the teaching profession. Yes, feel free to have any questions along the way. Hi, Chris. Chris has introduced themselves. They're in Sydney and did attend the first workshop and teachings Year 1 and Year 4. Nice to see you again, Chris. Stephanie hasn't done the first workshop and you're in Kinder. Oh, okay. And Joanne's in a Catholic primary school as well. Suzanne's really from the Northern Territory. She's trying to trick us. Did you say you were from somewhere else? Oh, okay. I see. Okay. So we've got primary teachers. We have some support, people with backgrounds in support teaching, backgrounds in EALD, working in EALD or ESL, whatever acronym you use in your area. We've got a bunch of people who didn't attend that first workshop, some people who have listened to it already, and then we've got people who did attend it and so know some of the strategies that I talked about in that. Look, I don't think that it's necessary that you attended the first workshop, but I have put this together with the understanding that you know some of those strategies from the book already. So you might have already had a read through them or done that first workshop with me. The whole workshop, this second workshop, really came about from an overwhelming response that we had at a national level, positive feedback, and really that want for another workshop. And we said, you know, do you want another workshop on another set of strategies? And a lot of people, majority of people said, yes, we really do. So here it is. And hopefully, like most sequels, this one is just as good as the first. I'm not better, we'll see. Again, it'll be really useful for you if you have your book with you to go and grab it so that you can make your notes on it and on the strategies as we go through them. If you want a minute to go and do that, feel free to go and do that now. Or just grab pen and paper or your cup of tea. Okay, so workshop 2, here we go. So during this session, I'll be going over some of the following strategies. Robin would like to introduce herself. She's the brains behind workshops.
I was very rude.
I don't think you were rude at all.
I'm sorry. I should have said hello, everyone, and I'm going to log out. Debbie runs these well and doesn't need me, so have a great time.
Thanks, Robin.
You're welcome.
So during this session, I'll be going over the following strategies. Now, these strategies I think are quite complementary to those that I covered in the first workshop. So I may refer to that first set of strategies as we go through, and it may make you think, and you wouldn't believe it, I do have the room with the wonderful sensor lights. Again, if you remember this room, I'm in a training facility in the ACT because I have 2 very small people at home that would run in and disturb us. And they're on sensor lights because most teachers, when they run training, are up and dancing around. Because I'm not, the lights may turn off at certain times. I'll keep waving my arms around and doing some interpretive dance for you so they stay on. So to begin with, this afternoon, we'll explore some strategies that directly link to those covered in the first workshop. So I'll explain how these strategies can link in with the others and just add some depth to those strategies in your literacy teaching. And following this, I'll go over a few strategies that are presented in the book that I would say are kind of alternative ways of teaching similar skills. And finally, I'd like to look at a few additional strategies that I think are a lot of fun and can really enhance your teaching. And there will be some time for questions at the end of the session, but also throughout, I'm happy for you to ask questions. Also, because we're a lovely, intimate group this afternoon, I'm happy for you to talk on the mic as well, if you want. Like the first workshop, for each strategy, I'll briefly explain the strategy, then I'll give some examples of how I've used it in my teaching, and there'll be time for you to practice and develop your knowledge of the strategies, using some activities, but also a lot of discussion during this workshop. I was going to say something else about the strategies. Oh well. So let's start out by going deeper. The first few strategies we'll look at are complementary to those that are covered in the first workshop. These will assist you to kind of go deeper with that original set of strategies and to get more from them. Oh, that's what I was going to mention. Like the first workshop, a lot of these strategies are going to seem very familiar to some of you, especially if you've had experience in a classroom as well. But I really want this to be a time where you can look at those strategies again and kind of feel some relief from all the pressures that you already have in the classroom, and some time to really look at the way you're teaching again and adjust it, and think about the strategies you are using and any you want to include. So let's start off with our first strategy, author study. This is explained on page 7 of the book. The very first strategy in the book. So throughout that first series of strategies, that first workshop, you may have noticed that a lot of them, and a lot of the strategies in the book, in fact, really rely on you having quality text in your classroom. You know, for read alouds, for guided reading, for reading conferences, you need quality text. So it makes sense that one strategy that really assists us to go deeper with this to go deeper with most of the strategies, is to ensure that you have quality text is an author study. So this strategy is something that is ongoing in your class. It doesn't need to be in a particularly dedicated time for it, but it might be something that you want a dedicated time, but it is something that easily can fit across what you're doing. So you don't need to have 20 minutes of author study. It can be useful to have a few minutes here and there to just mention parts, to be focused about the fact that you are studying certain authors at that time. What this strategy does do is open up your students' eyes to potential reading material for themselves. Like, I remember discovering Morris Gleitzman when I was in primary school from my teacher doing an author study on him. We read all his books. We found out information about him. Recently at a Stephen Lane PD I attended, he mentioned that good readers or literate people know their favourite authors. And I feel that our job as teachers is to develop those literate people in our classrooms. So really, that's the goal. We need to be able to not only introduce books to our students, but a range of authors from a range of genres. So let that sink in, a range of authors from a range of genres, because we want students who can walk into bookshops and say, oh, I really love Robin Hobb books. Oh, I really love J.K. Rowling. You know, and they know their favourite authors as literate people, and they know their favourite genres as literate people. So we want to develop that, and we can do that through author study. This strategy develops student skills also in reading and writing. In reading, there's a strategy that you might be familiar with called Read Like an Author, where you want to have your students trying to kind of get inside an author's head, thinking about why an author wrote that, how it's different from other books they've written, and what choices the author has and hasn't made in their writing. That reading like an author is really, you know, taking that inferential skill of reading kind of up a level, realising that this text was created by someone and for a purpose. In the same way, the strategy of writing like an author can be a great strategy in which writing skills are learned from looking at an author's writing style. I've often used this with my students, and particularly when you're using you know, narrative, because there are so many great authors out there, and you can be looking at the patterns that these different authors use in their narrative. So I've used the beginning of Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl many times as a great way of patterning narrative of another author's writing style. So, I could grab out lots of Roald Dahl's books and I could show you how he begins each of them. And he often begins with a setting. And here it's actually not the very beginning. It's chapter 2, the start of chapter 2, when introducing Mr. Fox. Roald Dahl does this beautiful thing. He writes, "On a hill above a valley there was a wood. And in that wood, there was a huge tree. And under that tree, there was a hole. And in that hole lived Mr. and Mrs. Fox and their 4 small foxes." So he does this almost zooming in to the setting, on a hill above a valley. In a wood, there was a huge tree. Under the tree, there was a hole. And in that hole, and so we're getting this bird's eye view as you zoom in to where Roald Dahl wants you to be focused. And that is something that I've used for pattern writing for kind of that setting or that beginning of a story across year levels, because you can change it. You can start with, in a city there was a house, and in that house there was an attic, and in that attic there was a family of 4 mice. So you can see how actually looking at authors, that can be your launch pad from great writing as well. So onto the steps here. The first step is to choose an author that you love. I would always have trouble looking past some of the authors that I love when doing author studies with students, but also allowing students to choose can be really powerful. When you're planning what authors you're going to look at as well, think about the genre and the range of genres in that as well. So I've often planned out author studies in advance. So I would, think about having a few authors from kind of fantasy or comedy, maybe a few that do kind of thriller writing, a few that do that kind of humorous or narrative, a few of those Princess Sparkle pony books, all those ones that, some pink and purple princesses love. But there's nothing wrong, if you don't want to do such a planned way of doing your author studies. You could also do an investigation into the books that your students enjoy reading. And I've done this as well with students when we've kind of gone around the circle and talked about, well, what are you reading at home? And, there are some students who aren't, but the ones that are can often suggest the books that they're reading or some of the authors they're reading or the books that they like. And you can almost do a backwards kind of investigation here, and you can be looking at, okay, well, you seem to like a lot of books that are about comedy. How about we do an author study on Andy Griffiths? And then you can plan that out as a class. Or, these students seem to really love fantasy. Let's look at Emily Rodda. It might be the opposite though. You might notice that a lot of your students keep reading fantasy after fantasy after fantasy, and you want them to read a different genre. So you plan that in. There are just so many great Australian authors that I don't feel like it's necessary to give you a list of great Australian authors here. But I think looking at Children's Book Council Australia, noticing some of the authors that are on there, looking at Reading Australia that I shared with you last time. Reading Australia is a beautiful website if you haven't heard me talk about it before. Or talk to a librarian and ask them what are some authors that they are really into at the moment or that are up and coming. The second step is to read their books. But here, I think it's so important to just collect as many of their books as you can. Get your dirty mitts on them and get your kids' hands on them. I've seen author studies previously where the books are kind of kept a secret before the teacher reveals them. I mean, that is one way of doing it, but I am very much a promoter of making sure that those books are visible and accessible in your classroom. So no matter how you get those books, make them available. And sometimes here you have to think outside the square. I have a colleague who's working in New South Wales, and her school is newly established and they don't have a librarian, let alone a library. So for her to get books of a certain author is quite a task. But what I suggested to her is, I know that ACT libraries have it, and I'm pretty sure that most libraries around Australia would. They have online collections of their books as well. So you as a person in the society can often log into your local library. You can access these ebooks online, and then there's a way of getting some of those books as well for your students to see. Because going to the bookshop often and buying all the author's books sometimes isn't feasible. So have a look at your local libraries as well and see if there's a way of getting some of those books as well into your classroom. I know lots of local libraries are keen to partner with schools. So you could read all the books very methodically, or you might just sample parts of the author's books each week, but you'd make this work for your schedule. So when I was using Graham Base books, and Graham Base was our author for author study, we used his whole books, and we were using his books to look at interesting words for our word study. We were using his books for our guided reading groups. We were using his books for my read alouds. We were using his books for patterned writing. And so we were using it for all our work, all our literacy work. That was our text for that week or that fortnight. When we looked at Jackie French, because her books are so long, what we do is we just get a sample. So it might be a chapter or even just a page or two, and we use that sample as our text for that week or that fortnight. Are there any of you that have text lists that are planned out for you? I know that this is something that some people in other states have, or even just other schools. I'm lucky enough in ACT that I have some freedom in the text that I can choose. But I mean, in that, you need to be able to make sure that those authors that you want to expose your kids to, that can fit into your planning. It doesn't need to be an extra time. So thirdly, it's a great idea to discover more about the author, because this is the way that we get the students to remember that author's name. I was doing some author studies one time and I was like, you know, oh, we've done Gary Crew for like a few weeks now. They should really be able to know Gary Crew. And then a few weeks later I said, oh, do you remember Gary Crew? Who? So what I realised that I hadn't done is actually giving the students some memorable parts about that author. And by telling the students more about that author and their story, this is how we make them memorable. So it could be just through getting the students, or as a class doing some research on that author, or even as you read each book, you could find out about the author's process in creating it. And these are often published actually on the publisher's websites or author sites. Oh, sorry. I like to do pretend interviews with authors. So this way students can develop their questions that they want to ask the author, and then I pop out with the glasses and wig on and pretend that I'm Morris Gleitzman or Roald Dahl, and all the kids scream and think it's hilarious. But then you can go through with that interview and as if you're the author, talk about your process in writing. This not only makes the author memorable for the students, but it also helps them to get inside the author's head, to find out more and to develop that critical literacy skills. Some authors would be happy to email you back if you want to email them as well, and that's a really memorable way of students connecting with an author. One other thing around this is that sometimes what you can do as well is, you know, think about those little process stories of what that author has gone through to make that book, and you can tell the students those stories. So, for example, Mutt Dog, one of my favourite books by Stephen Michael King. This book was actually inspired because Stephen Michael King had this really raggy, mutty looking dog. And then I show that picture of the dog to the students, and suddenly they've now got this image that goes with Stephen Michael King, so they've got another way to remember him. The fourth step here is to compile some information about the author and then have some way of kind of sharing that. I like to complete a summary sheet at the end of each author study, really simple, where we'd write up the author's name, their style, what we enjoyed about their writing, maybe some of their books, and then we just display these in the classroom for students to continue to refer to throughout the year. But you could do this in any way that you want. Your students might get so into an author or their writing that you want them to create mini movies about the author. Recreating the book using any mode. You could get students to draw a part of the book, to develop it digitally, to act it out, to create a photo story about the book. Or even just to write something in their reading response journal, which is another strategy in the book that I spoke about in the first workshop. And they could share their thinking about each author. So I'm now going to for our activity. We're going to have a listen to Gary Crew, who is an author that I mentioned before. He's one of my favourites. He, on this website, it's you can see the website down there, Reading Australia / author interviews. He explains his process about writing a certain book. Now, there are lots of authors on this site that explain their processes, so it's absolute gold if you're using it for author study. Be warned, though, that most of the texts that are spoken about, I think, are for secondary. Let's just try to get there and see that will work for us. Sorry, it's taking a bit of time to load. Okay, oh, and the page is gone. I think, sorry, this must look very funny for you. Thank you for bearing with me while I just try to get to Gary Crew's author's interview. There he is. Okay. So we're going to just have a quick look at this one where he speaks about his process in writing. He is talking about a secondary book, his Strange Objects, which I definitely would not read in primary. But you can use snippets of this and what he talks about just to explain his process. What I want you to do as Gary Crew is think about how, what we can learn from listening to him share his process, what we can learn as writers.
All around me, and writing does that. So the time just is gone. I'll start work. If my students die, they have a heart attack.
Okay, there we go. All right. It's from this point that I want us to listen, just for a short period.
True.
Why do you still do that?
I truly do believe, and I teach my students this, and all my students die, they have a heart attack. So at the moment I'm working on a novel called, a subject called Writing Your Novel. It's all these young, fresh, young things came in. I gave each one of them a journal. I bought down the road at the local, trading post.
Yeah.
I gave each one of them a 2B pencil and an eraser. I said, this is what we're writing on this semester. And they all went, literally, there's a generation that actually can't handwrite. They actually can't write by hand. But I believe that I've got several computers. If I'm travel or whatever, I use different one. Of course I do, it's fabulous, great thing. But I believe there is a connection between like the brain going down the arm and through the hand and through the pencil or through the pen, which is more intimate contact with the page than your fingers on a keyboard looking at a grey screen. I don't get turned on by looking at a piece of a touch screen. It doesn't excite me at all. I do get turned on by looking at lined paper and thinking I can fill that with my personal human marks. And I think it's kind of like the cave person in me who wants to make smudges on walls.
I'm just going to stop it there. He does go on to talk more about that process. Is there anything that struck you in what Gary Crew spoke about when talking about his writing process? Anything that you feel, your students would even be able to learn a little bit from, or yourself as a writer from listening to that? What does that way that he explains his process teach you about his writing or about writing in general? Feel free to use the mic if you want to talk. Yeah, I think you're right there, Susan. The usefulness of writing by hand, transferring your thoughts onto paper, this really strikes me. The importance of actually writing, yes. And handwriting as well, that's right. And I think it's something that we undervalue so much, actually allowing students to put their thoughts on paper, for it to be messy, for it to be, not neat, to actually allow that to be such a physical process, different drafts, exactly. I like that, you know, it makes me think a lot more about his writing then. He almost talks about it like an extension of himself. That's right. And I think Jane's getting onto that as well with that personal experience. It's a part of the experience of actually creating something that's really powerful. Yeah, so you can see how just seeing, oh, yeah, and Jess. Yeah, so actually, thanks, Jess. That's great. Jess is talking about psychology in her previous degree, and that handwriting is processed at a different level rather than typed writing. Oh, wow, you wrote most of your thesis? You're incredible. Maybe I should try that with mine. Yeah, and I think it is important to allow students to use pen and paper. I think, though, as well, it's important to think about that as a writer, that this writer has not sat down at a computer to type out his story for us. He has written it. He's laboured over each word as he put them on into the book. And if you then read a book after hearing that, Gary Crew in his process stick a bit more with you than it would if I just said this book is by Gary Crew. The natural flow of writing and imagination. Beautiful. Oh, you guys, I love it. I love all the sharing. It's wonderful. Let's keep moving on. Our next strategy that we're going to look at is modelled writing. This is on page 38. It really links in a lot with shared writing that I spoke about in the first workshop. Yeah, Liz, how, I think that point, sorry, going back to what Liz has written there, what shocks me about what Gary Crew says every time I listen to that is that there is a generation of students that actually can't handwrite. Like, and that's a generation he's teaching as a university lecturer now. So that's not talking about the students that are going through primary school now. That's a generation that is going through or has just gone through. Yeah, and that allowing that turnaround, I think, you know, it's up to us to allow them to write, to develop that handwriting skill. And thinking aloud as well. Okay, sorry. So we're getting now to modelled writing on page 38. That was a little tangent. I'm happy with tangents though. You can always, you know, grab the recording later if you want to listen to me, or not listen to the tangents, and you can fast forward over them. So when we're talking about this gradual release of responsibility model in writing, model writing is that first step. And it's so important that we get it right. It is a very planned strategy though. Even though when you present it, it may present as if it's quite ad hoc. So when you're modelling writing, you need to be really mindful of what you're going to be focusing on while you do this. So is your goal going to be punctuation? Is it going to be spelling of a certain word? Is it going to be a particular grammatical element? Or is it going to be the whole text structure as a whole? You need to choose something that will allow your think alouds to be really focused around this. I read a really interesting article about modelled writing and about teachers who, when they weren't particularly planned in their modelled writing episodes, often would revert to focusing on spelling and punctuation and talking about, oh, I've put a capital at the start of that sentence and a full stop at the end, and that would be their think alouds, even if that wasn't their focus, just because they hadn't planned what those think alouds had been, or hadn't, I guess, thought meaningfully about what they wanted to achieve. And I actually do this as well. And I've caught myself doing this when I've been trying to do modelled writing episodes. So remember that every think aloud you use needs to be really purposeful. So I would say step 0 before step 1, and if you want to write it down, is to have a goal. Decide on what your goal will be and be really focused on it, and have that as your focused goal for your modelled writing episode. Okay, and then step 1 is to select a text type. And here, don't feel constrained when you're planning your text types. But if you do have a specific goal in mind, I'd suggest choose a text type that will help you to portray that. So, for example, if I notice my students are really struggling with their concise planning, I used narrative to help me model this. I modelled for those students how to construct a story map, which I'll talk about later, and then how that would actually translate into a story. And I did this because my students were having trouble planning their writing ahead of actually sitting down to write. They were so keen to get started, they wouldn't actually think about how they would end. So this goal could have been used with many text types, concise planning, but I used narrative because it was something that the students all had a good understanding of as a text type. And they were quite familiar with. The second step here is to start by explaining what you're going to be writing and be really clear here. It might feel a bit awkward the first time you do it, and explain what your goal is. So today I'm going to write a story. I'm going to focus on planning a well-structured story. And then great thing to do at this point is also write this on the board as a learning intention or a learning goal. So then the students can tell you at the end of the lesson if they achieve this, or if you achieved this even better when you were doing your modelled writing. And this is called learning intentions, if you know a bit about David Hattie and his ideas. So that's kind of bridging that gap there as well about goal setting and modelling that goal setting for your students. Also at this point, share who they are writing for. And the first few times that you do this, be clear about why you're sharing that. It doesn't matter to students if you're telling them, oh, well, I'm writing for my friend. Oh, so what? So tell them why that matters. I'm writing for the teacher, so it has to be really clear what my ideas are so that she understands. I'm writing for the preschoolers today, so my vocab shouldn't be too complex. I'm writing to send out this to our education minister, so my writing needs to show a depth of vocabulary. It needs to be really clearly understood, and I could probably use some formal language in this. So then there's a third point. After you explain what you'll be writing about, begin writing. And as you do this, talk aloud about what you're thinking. And a few people I can see, I'm just glancing back on the chat so that I can keep talking, but I will go back through and have a read through. I'm happy that you're all connecting in it though as well. I know a lot of people have already mentioned the think aloud and how it is really powerful. So these think alouds are the gold of modelled writing. So be really prepared here though as what you want to say. To begin with, I would actually, as I was starting out, but also sometimes I still do this, I have my points on a post-it note, a sticky note or even a piece of paper, and I stick it kind of on the side of my board so that I can see my notes, so that I make sure that I keep track of it. Or you can be even more open with this and you can have it on your board because it's good for your students to also see that you are being intentional in what you're talking to them about. So if my goal for students is to write a more engaging beginnings in their story, I might say, okay, so I've already planned my story, but to begin, I need a way to hook in the reader. I know that the first words of my story are going to be the most important. So rather than starting with once upon a time, which is very used, I'm going to start with some action. I'm going to get straight to the complication of my story and then slowly reveal the rest of the introduction. So I'm going to write, bam, the train came off the tracks with a jolt. And I'm writing as I'm speaking about it. But I'm doing that think aloud of why I'm doing it before I write. I wouldn't then start being like, oh, and look, I've used a capital letter and I've used an exclamation mark, unless that's my goal. Because my goal is just to make sure that they've got that hook at their introduction. That's my goal. So you can see how think alouds really should reveal to the students what your hidden reasons are, what the thinking is behind writing choices. And your goal is for students to internalise these think alouds so that they use them when they go to write. So the fourth step talks about kind of continuing the text with students as a modelled writing piece, and then actually developing this into the next stage of gradual release, which is a joint construction, in which your students will participate in developing the text. You could then change your goal as you do this, and you can then use that text to show editing skills later on. Which actually, if spelling or punctuation wasn't your main goal to begin with, it could be a teaching point at this step, at the 4th step when you're editing. I would advise that you don't need to complete the whole text with students though. It would be way too much teacher talk if we did this. As teachers, we are often the ones doing all the talking in the classrooms anyhow. So just complete the parts of the text that serve your purpose, as long as the students understand the way the text is going, and then allow your students to practice with you, and then allow them to have time to use that language focus, that goal of the lesson in their own writing. You can always come back to your model writing and keep using that piece with another goal in mind. So depending on your year group, depends on how long you can keep your students engaged in modelled writing, but I would suggest 5 to 15 minutes, and 15 minutes is really stretching it for some kids. It's long enough for any student. Okay, I want you now to share in the chat or on the mic that I want you to imagine that you're modelling the writing of a crime story, or it could just be a narrative if crime story is not your piece of cake. What would you say as a think aloud when considering your purpose? What would you say as a think aloud when considering your purpose of a crime story? Say your goal is to teach students about the purpose of this, right? The crime story. What might you say? Just giving you some time to type if you're typing in the chat, but you're also welcome to take the mic and share it. I'm not trying to trick you, there's no right answer here, but what would you say if you were trying to teach them what the purpose of their crime story was going to be? That was a think aloud. Okay, so while some people are still thinking about that or writing it, yes, beautiful, Annette. That's a great idea. So Annette's think aloud would be, I really want to have some different ideas, some red herrings. So I'm going to plan these even before I start. Great. One that I would think about is I really want this crime story or my mystery to have some suspense in it. So I'm going to make sure that I take a while to get to reveal the real problem. I'm going to have a few, like you said, red herrings. So I'm going to add that suspense in. It does take a bit of thought and time to really make sure that these goals are achievable in something that you can model as well for your students. If you did want to share another idea there, feel free to. I'm going to just keep moving on to our next one. Okay, we're going to have a look now at feature lists, and these are separated in the book across 2 different areas, but I've actually combined them. So up to you where you want to turn to, perhaps page 20 if you want to look at that, the written feature list, or page 70, 71 if you want to look at visual text feature lists. There are some commonalities between them. I've actually combined them here because I think most of our texts actually include visual and written components. So it makes sense to actually look at both together when you're looking at a feature list. Susan's mentioned as well that giving clues, making a trail to follow. Don't tell them too much and put a twist in, to put the reader off track. Great ideas for think alouds around crime if you're writing a crime story with your kids. So feature lists are one of those strategies that once you learn how to use them, it'll be second nature to use this strategy when you're teaching writing or creating visual text. It's also really a stepping stone in being able to critically analyse text, which I talked about in the first workshop, and it was a lot of fun when we were analysing those visual texts. So to be able to critically analyse them, we firstly need to know the parts of that text, and that's what a feature list gives us. It also is a way of assisting in reading and comprehension. Once students know what they're looking for or where to find it, it's much easier for them to be able to read and understand a text. Stephanie had another idea there as well around the crime story and a think aloud there. I want to engage my reader in the story, so I want them to imagine the crime scene. So I'm going to use adjectives to describe what the detectives will see, smell, feel when he walks into the crime scene. Great idea, Stephanie. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. A beautiful another way of having a think aloud or even a goal for that model writing episode. So the steps here are for our feature list are to firstly select a text type. And here, I would suggest again, when you're thinking about text types, think outside the box. I feel like I say it a lot when I'm doing training, but I think that the standardised testing that we have in Australia and in our states, and I'm not going to mention its name because we know what it is, it's got us thinking only about a handful of text types when we're teaching narrative and persuasive. But only teaching these text types in our classroom is taking that whole genre approach really to the extreme. A genre approach asks us to look at the text around us and to find those distinguishing features in them that match similar texts. And the book actually talks a lot about using a genre approach. So if you're not aware of what I mean by that, do go and have a look at it yourself. So when we're using a genre approach, some of the text types that you can use are planned in advance, and they are planned in like narrative, informational report, persuasive ads, but others might come from student inquiry. I was watching War on Waste, that great ABC documentary with Craig Rewcastle in it a few years ago, and we were looking at, he was talking about the banning the bags, so you can tell it's a bit dated now. My students loved this idea, and Craig actually had a call for action at the end of this episode and said, you know, if you want to write to your minister, go and do that now. So my students were like, yeah, we want to write to our minister. So our genre or our text type came from the students there. They were interested in writing to the minister, so our text type was then, okay, how do we write a formal letter? And then that turned into how do we write a formal email and how does that change? And that was our end goal. So select your text type however you do it, but do feel free to think outside that box. The second step here is that when you collect examples, the aim is to get a range of the text type and demonstrate those similarities between them. So this is when we show that that text has a type. There are certain things that are going to be in that text all the time. And you want the students to notice those commonalities, like, oh, look, they all have titles. But you might also want to collect examples of the text type. You might want to do the collecting. I mean, if that text type is quite specific. It can also, though, add an element of the investigation. They mention it in the book, allowing your students to collect examples of the text type. But make sure whatever you do, those examples are authentic. I mean, we've got so much work as it is as teachers. Don't spend a few days writing procedures yourself. Putting them together yourself. Find authentic ones. Find them in cookbooks, on building websites, on the back of frozen food packets. Make those texts as authentic as possible, because in the end we want our students to be writers for the real world one day, not just writers for schools. When doing a feature list on persuasive ads, I found a whole heap of them, and this is an example of one of them up on the slide that we used. But I also allowed students to bring in ones that they'd seen from home, or notice ones as well when they were using the computers for work, when they were looking at magazines in class. In that sense, it was kind of a guided investigation. I showed them what type of text I wanted, what type of text we're going to focus on, and then I let them bring in similar examples. But in saying that, non-examples of texts that are different from the norm also make great teaching points. And you can look at, oh, well, is this kind of a subgenre then? When I was looking at picture books with students, they thought they had all over it. They thought they knew exactly what needed to be in a feature list of a picture book. And then I bring in the Stinky Cheese Man and Other Fairly Stupid Tales. If you haven't seen this book, it's pure gold. And it's a postmodern picture book in which the narrator actually tries to engage with the audience, and they move through the story in really a non-linear fashion. So it made my students really pull apart then what a picture book was. And then they had to refine their goals about what they wanted in a picture book. So I feel that the third step here, which is to create a chart noting all the features, is a step that we are most likely to miss. Sometimes it's easy to talk about the features, but then actually making that physical chart can sometimes be that part that we get to and there's not time for or not space for. But this is a part where we can allow students to represent the features, and we can represent the features so they can internalise those parts of the text and replicate them in their own. What I've learnt is that this chart needs to be memorable. And I've got my narrow burger up there on the slide. And this is something that I borrowed from another teacher, and other teachers have borrowed from me. So feel free to share it around. Make it work for your own kids so you can see this works for a particular age group and not others. And, we'd have that each part of the burger would be a part of the narrative. And then in each part of the burger, we wrote down some of the features that you'd find there. And I've got some other examples on the next page of other feature lists that I've used. But, I had narrow burger, I had procedure pancakes, we had information report ice cream, we had recount roller coaster, and all of these, they're a bit kitschy, but they also make it a bit memorable for kids about those parts. I know there are some great ones out there though at the moment as well. So if you've got some ideas as well of feature lists, feel free to share them in the chat. I often will make the feature list, but then try to make it able to have optional extras, because sometimes you'll be noticing things that students are missing from their narratives or persuasive texts, or from their, graphic novels or whatever you're writing as they're making them. And you want to be able to add those features in, so don't make it set in stone, whatever you do. And finally, and very obviously, a feature list should end with students actually creating their own text. And students should be able to look back at the feature list and refer to it and tick off parts as they do this. And then follow up this strategy by completing that critical analysis of the text type you've chosen, because now students can really, and then we could start looking at the Stinky Cheese Man again, and we could start doing critical analysis of this text now that we really know what should be in a narrative. So here are some other examples of feature lists that I've used in some other forms. Success criteria are amazing if you haven't seen them before. Another way of doing a feature list as well though, and this might not be something that's up on the wall, it might be something that's in students' books. And I've often done these as a group as well, where we would write down the parts of the text and then we'd write some of the things that we find in that part. And you can be really specific here, and you can see that when I've done them for junior, it's really specific, like 1 or 2 sentences. You've got 2 technical terms, and we kind of talk about, that it's more than 1 sentence, things like that, to the point that when you're getting them to upper and you're looking at information report ice creams, yes, I have the parts there of what is in an information report, but I also have some features down here of things that need to be included as well. So you can go as broad or as specific as you want with your feature lists. So now for a little bit of a fun activity. Well, I hope it's fun anyway. I'm going to get you to have a look at these school websites, and I want you to put down one thing in the chat or talk on the mic and tell us one thing that you would add for a feature list for them. I've chosen 4 different school websites. And these are from, I tried to do it from all around Australia, so I've got a bit of a broad look. I'm putting the link in the chat now. You'll see some of them are public schools, some of them are private. And yeah, go and have a look at 1 or 2 or 3 or all 4, and then come back and write something in the chat that you notice all of them have. So if I was to go and make a school website, I would need to know what to put in it. We might only have maybe 5 minutes for this. So Stephanie's already noticed there's information there about the school. Great thing to add to a feature list. Anyone know something visual about all these texts? Illustrations? Yeah. Is there anything specific that we can see in the illustrations or the pictures? I mean, you could even just see it from the slide. Anything that a lot of them include? What kinds of images do they use? Yeah, images of students generally. How do those students look? What are those students doing? What similarities are we noticing? So really draw this out and be as specific as you want in this feature list. A school motto or beliefs, good one. Some way to get in contact with the community. Yep. So there's contact, I think, in all of them. Search functions, news, latest infos, yep. Aspirational language, beautiful, and I love it. Yeah, they talk about curriculum info. All of them talk about, you know, that they strive for the best in curriculum and that curriculum's a focus. You know, they also have really similar formats as well as websites. They have a menu up the top. They all seem to have this kind of top space where you've got the name of the school. They all have images. Passion for learning. They've got persuasive language, that's right. And who are they trying to persuade? They've got principal, chat. This is great, guys. You're really getting lots from here. Yeah, for parents, that's right. They're not trying to persuade teachers to come teach at that school. Often these are folk or students. They're trying to persuade parents. Yeah, and the community. That's a good point. The community to choose the school. Yeah, so the persuasive features here are that children are happy, the background is positive, serious and sober colours. That's true. There's no hot pinks. They're very kind of bland. Not bland, but yeah, palatable colours. Happy, engaged learners, photos of students. Yeah, you don't see the student hiding on a desk in any of those. So you can see how some critical analysis can come through here as well when you're talking about what are the features of these texts. If you've got any other ideas, feel free to pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to move on now to our next strategy. Okay, so I've talked about this next part as almost taking a different tact. During the first workshop, I spoke about guided reading and writing conferences. So if you haven't had a look at these in the book, mark that down as strategies to go and have a look at. The next 3 strategies that I'm going to focus on will develop those same outcomes, reading and the writing skills, but they use slightly different names to get there. And this doesn't mean that they're necessarily replacements for the other strategies. They can actually complement them. But they will suit certain cohorts of students better than others. I know that we've got a number of teachers who are in the early grades with us. this afternoon. So don't feel that these strategies don't suit you, because we can talk about how they would suit younger cohorts as well. So the first one that we're going to look at is reading circles. Now, don't get overwhelmed by the amount of steps here. This strategy, when you flick to page 40, 44 and 45, you're going to see there are a lot of steps here in reading circles. And I think that's because the authors really want to be very specific in how you can conduct a reading circle effectively. So during the first session, I touched on reading response journals. This is another strategy that if you haven't had a look at yet, you need to go and have a look at. And how they could be incorporated into guided reading was something that I spoke about. Well, the reading circle strategy really takes that use of the reading response journal into more of a formalized approach. And you can see what the authors were thinking here with the use of a reading response journal when you read about them in the reading circles part. So reading circles are also known as things like book clubs or book studies. And in this strategy, students are presented with different book sets to choose to read. So the choice is kind of a constrained choice in what they're reading. They then select which book they would like to read, and they read it, and they respond to that book that they are reading in their response journals, and then they share these responses with other members of their group. So you can see there's some similarities here in how it would work in a guided reading model as well. So the steps here are that firstly, this whole process, because it's a huge process really, it needs to be modelled and explained, and that's going to take time. And then secondly, you'll need to choose some text for each group, or you'll need to choose enough text to allow those groups to have choices. So if you want to have 4 groups and you only want students to be in those 4 groups, only choose 4 sets of texts. Again here though, you can think outside of the box as to what text you want. So I used this beautiful photo story that I think I just found it when I was like flicking through one of those sites that has, you know, pictures and words to go with them. And it was a photojournalism around survivors, and each of these pictures had a story about each of the survivor underneath, and the stories might have been maybe 300, 400 words, but the images were really powerful as well. And so that was the text that I used with a group of my students. I printed out the pictures, and then I had the text on the back that went with each of the survivors, and that was the text that we used for one of my groups as a study. And that way it also linked in with what our inquiry was that term as well. Or it could, so, you know, thinking beyond books though, it could also be newspaper articles. So I've put a link here to, or I've put the website here, ALEA, and that's a great website where you can find newspaper articles or news articles, and it actually shows you what kind of level they're suited to for reading. It is an American website, so be warned that there will be a lot of US news there. But I find that it's really great for particularly geography or science articles, things that aren't particularly based around US politics. So it can be, you know, on anything really, whatever your text is. It could, if you're having trouble finding sets of books, you might do photocopies of certain extracts of that book, and that might be your text for a group. Or it might be that you do different titles, but by the same illustrator or author, and that way you tie in with, say, your author studies. So, you know, you might have 5 authors that you're going to do that term, or 6 authors, and then those are your sets of books as well for your reading circles. Oh, sorry, I don't have a link there. I've just got a picture of what the website is. It's Newsella, and it's, I'll show you it as well. So here it is. It's part of it's free. Like most things nowadays, you do have to join or sign in. But when you do sign in, you can access all these articles. So I often look at science or sometimes math articles. And then when you click into them, is it going to let me do it now? You can see what the Lexile level is, or reading level is, of these articles. And then you can actually adjust them to get easier, which is nice. So these are text sets. You can see some of them are locked. I'll just try to show you what one looks like. You can log in through Google as well, and if you use Google Classrooms, you can actually post these articles on your classroom, which I love to do. And some of the articles actually have follow-up activities and stuff with them. This one just isn't opening for us right now. Let's see if we can go back and find another one to show you. Browse, let's just browse some. And we're going to get something very strange, I'm sure. Okay, there we go. Ethiopian Prime Minister. So you can sign up your students as well if you have the authority to do that. You can see here it's got a word count, and you can see over in this corner the Lexile level, and you can change that as well. So I could make that easier to read. I can make it more tricky. But this is what comes up originally, is what the original article was. They're all from good sources like the Washington Post, but again, it's all US. And so when I change it, it should have gotten easier to read there. And then there's activities as well that you can assign. But I think these are great as text sets. So, you know, you've got a set there, or you might use the one article and have them at different levels for your different groups, which I've done, or you might have mixed ability groups, and then you can just have the one article, different articles for each group, and those groups are still mixed ability and it still works for everyone in the group. So that's Newsella. If you haven't seen it before, it's a brilliant website and I use it a lot. So you're thinking outside the box there about what selection of book sets or text sets you're going to use. It is pretty cool. And then choose, the third step here is that students have to choose through a ballot system of which text they'd like. Now, you know this is going to be a social game where students try to choose the same text as their friends. So yes, it could be a teaching point of thinking about how do you work best. Are students developing insight about their own work habits? Or it might be that you go back to your predetermined groups and give those predetermined groups some choice in the text that they read. The fourth step here is that you need to write or draw that whole process and explain it. And it's really explained very well in the book, so I won't go over all that now. But the whole process basically is, you know, to read for 20 minutes to do the strategy, and then for 3 days, sorry, I'm the light on again. No, really thinks that I've disappeared now. There we go. Read for 3 days and then respond. And then on the next day, you discuss and share, and finally you write a response in your journal. But I think there's a lot of ways of making this suit your class as well. So don't feel that that is a structure that you have to keep if you want to do reading circles and that doesn't work for you. The fifth point is to model some responses, which is a great thing to do when you're reading aloud. Show how you would respond to that text that you've just read aloud. The sixth point is that students need to then read and respond. They need to have some way of responding. And this might be that you need to be a bit more structured about it in younger years, whereas in older years you might want them to respond using a certain strategy. So how did you connect to the text? What were your predictions? Or getting inside that author's head about the text. The seventh point talks about letting this then become a collaborative exercise. So this is when we develop it into something that takes the strategy kind of up a few grade levels. And I'd be okay only doing this kind of with mature year 5 and year 6 kids, but I mean, you know your kids. I wouldn't do it with younger. And these are reading agreements where they talk about how long they'll read for each session, where they'll read up to, if they'll all read up to the same point or their own point. And it's trying to make these groups kind of working well as a group and independent of your guidance. Step 8 talks about how that process will continue with that collaborative input. And I would almost want to do that as a class for younger year levels where we talk about, okay, how long should we be reading for? When do we need to stop and write our responses? When do we want to all start to share our response to the book? And then the 9th point talks about allowing students to share their work. I often make this a non-negotiable with, of course, the input of my students after a certain number of weeks. So we decide that, okay, after 5 weeks, we're all going to share something about our book, because sometimes I find it too difficult to wait until all students have finished reading because they all read at different paces. What they could share could be really interactive, or it could be very plain. And I think sometimes fan fiction, or almost a sequel to what they've read, or even just acting out a part of it, is perfect. And because whatever you do, it shouldn't take too much prep. You don't want to waste reading time by making students make, amazing dioramas of their book. So do whatever your students can construct in one cycle of 5 lessons. And for some students, that actually might be too long. You might say to them, I'm going to give you 2 lessons to construct a response to show I want it to be, a dramatic piece about some part of the book. So where guided reading really is a strategy that can be used across year levels, you can see how this one, reading circles, is a strategy that really suits upper primary and middle school. However, if you're keen to try this strategy in the early years, it also can work wonders. If you're interested in using it with a younger class, you might make those responses less formalised, or more formalised, sorry. You might use thinking cards, that have words like what, when, who, why and how on them, and students can respond to each of those questions as they work through them. And those sessions should only run for as long as your students can read independently. So not necessarily the 20 minutes that it talks about in the book, however long your students can read or work independently, because you want to be free during this time to go and listening to your students reading. You might make your presentations in a really clear template that you want students to use. However, the basic idea of reading circles or mini book clubs can stay the same regardless of your level. I think what would be good at this point, because reading circles are like a book club, is to reflect on your own experience of a book club, if you've ever been in one, if you haven't, if you've seen them in schools or outside of school, and just share something about it. Maybe what was a positive from a book club that you were a part of or that you ran, what was perhaps a takeaway or a constructive piece that you find difficult about book clubs. Told you there'd be lots of discussion. Here's another little discussion point. So I'll start by sharing mine, and then I'll leave the mic open if anyone else wants to talk. Feel free to talk. So I was part of a book club, and I really liked the fact that it got me reading different genres than I would have read if I was to go out and choose the books myself. I found some beautiful books I'd never read before. So I think what comes out of that for me is that I'd want to almost get my groups to plan out their reading. So yes, they might have a newspaper article 1 week, but then I want them to read an extract of a fantasy novel. It's not 1 week, but like for a month or however long you run your book club for. And then I might want them to read a fantasy novel next time, just so that I can do what I had and have that experience of just kind of getting that broader taste of different books. One thing I found difficult is that I'm quite a slow reader, and all the women who I was in the book club with, they were very fast readers, and so I often found that I was coming to our book clubs with kind of half-prepared stuff. So I think allowing students to be able to go at their own paces during a book club is really important, so that they don't get disheartened and then leave and not join the book club again, which totally is not what happened to me. So I think those are some things that I've learned. Yeah, how they started widening their reading. Someone shared that's something they loved. Yeah, reading and talking about the books. Introduced to different genres and different authors. okay, the ones that you've run have always had really formal roles, and I've seen that as well done in the classroom as well, where you have your formal roles of recorders. In this, it's more a collaborative exercise, so if your students want to develop those formal roles, they can. But I'm just going to show you the next slide now. If you're still sharing about your book clubs, that's fine. Here, they talk about reading circles and what it would look like across 5 days in the book. So in the yellow is what the book talks about when you're structuring 5 days or a week, or however your 5 days look for reading circles. I say 5 days because I know that you're not going to get 5 days in a week, so it might be that you have a few days one week and a few the next. They talk about responding for the first 3 days, for those first 20 minutes, or however long your book clubs go for, your reading circles. On day 4, you share that. And then day 5, you write your journal response. I've thought about some different ways that I've used. So I had that we would read one day, respond the next, read one day, respond the next, and then we'd have sharing at the end of that period. So after 2 responses, what I found there was that yes, my students were having more time to read and more time to be able to respond. But what I found is that some students would not remember what they want to respond to the day after. They, goldfish memories like me, they would need to be able to respond while they were reading. Also, I found that sharing then came too long after, especially if we were waiting a week to share. So what I then changed to was reading and responding for one session and then sharing in the next. This just allowed me to have those longer sessions of reading and responding in the journal. And also students were doing it as they were reading. So they were having that focus time where they could just read, they could respond themselves, and then the next session they could share with their group about what they all noticed. And like someone said in the chat, then they can talk about some of those discussions, they can talk about vocab that they came across, and you might be really focused as well. You might say, I want you in your reading groups to be looking at the vocab. I want you to be noting any interesting vocab, and that's what everyone's goal is today. Or it might be more individualised, and you might pick up on those goals as you're reading with students, and they might have those goals to do individually in their reading circles. They are really good for top readers and being able to extend them as well and getting them to think more deeply. And in the same respect, for our readers who have difficulty, having that peer group push can sometimes be helpful for their reading as well. But of course, choosing texts that are going to help them to engage in a group as well. Okay, moving right along now, we're going to look at shared reading. This is explained on page 56 and 57. It might seem like a really simple strategy. I love that most of the strategies in the book are those strategies that you think, oh yes, like that is a great strategy. That's something that I've known for years, but I haven't actually gone back and looked at it or used it, or I find it hard to fit in. So shared reading is one of those strategies. It's just a beautiful strategy. You love it, but it's about making sure we use it. When I think of shared reading, and I talked about this in the first workshop, I do think about Stephen Lane, who is the king of read aloud, and how he talks about hot reads. When I saw him first present, he talked about hot reads, and I wanted to adapt this for my class. Hot reads are basically books that you promote in your class. So you say, this is fantastic, Mr. Fox, and I love it. You might, dress up as a fox before you read it the first time. You really want students to fall in love with this book, and then you read it aloud and you read aloud and you read aloud. And I decided for my hot read, I would read that to my class every day for a week, the same one every day for a week. And I was so surprised that my students actually liked it. I thought they would get bored with the same text day after day after day. I was using picture books for this because I was in junior. I think I was in year 2 when I started doing these hot reads. But what I found with these students is actually after a day or 2 of me reading the same text, the kids would join in the reading. And that is what shared reading is. It's when those kids start to join in. It's when the reading becomes a shared practice. So it's taking the strategy of read alouds to the next level. We're sharing stories with the class more than once So they're able to internalise the story structure and read the story along with you, understand that vocabulary. So all those strategies and hints I spoke about for read alouds, when I spoke about it in the first workshop, also apply here. That you choose something that you love, that you rehearse it, that you add expression, and that you allow students to respond to the reading. And these steps are all the same when you're talking about shared reading. But there are a few additional steps here, and you might see them already, and that is to reread and reread and reread. And reread, and each time you do this, allow your students to join in with the reading. This might mean that for some students, they need some kind of cue to know when to join in. It might mean that you need to slow your pace. It might mean that you have a signal. I often find just having a pause, or an extended pause, means that students start to join in. It might be that you have really structured and you say, I'm going to read the first page and you're going to read the next. And it's a perfect way to teach some of those different readings that you can see on both pages when they talk about shared reading. However, I would add that this also assists students to internalise story structure and enhances their vocabulary by exposing them to a range of language. It really does develop that read aloud strategy. I shared the story of how I read the Magic Hat to a group of ELAD Kinder students during my first workshop. Well, this was a book that I had used, yes, as a read aloud, but then it became shared reading as we read it each day that week. I read it every day to the class, and these students, mostly ELAD, mostly non-readers yet, or like pre-readers, and slowly they were able to join in reading this book, and after a week they were reading it as a group with minimal prompting from me. It was just mind-blowing, and it showed me again the power of shared reading. We then used that shared reading book to allow students to internalise the story, and they were able to then use that story structure to develop story maps and understand that language and the structure of a narrative. Again, this is another strategy that talks about using text and using great texts. So, do you have a favourite text to read aloud? Share it now in the chat or on the mic if you have a favourite read aloud text. I've already shared Magic Hat is one of mine. Charlotte's Web, beautiful. Amy and Lewis, who's that one by Stephanie? I can picture the cover, but I forget who it's by. Going on a Bear Hunt, yes, beautiful read aloud. Mutt Dog's another one of my favourite ones. Pig the Pug, brilliant. Tough Boris, oh yes. Birdie and the Bear. Georgie Grub. I Went Walking, yeah. Oh, that's another beautiful one. Oh, it's Libby Gleason, that's who it's by. Who Sank the Boat, another brilliant one. There are some brilliant read alouds here, and I can see a pattern here in the books that you're choosing. Oh, the Willows, yes, gorgeous. Oh, David Wallens, The Snake in My School, The Ugly Five by Julia Donaldson. Oh, Julia Donaldson makes brilliant books for shared reading. My favourite from hers is The Highway Rat. Highway Riding. Picky book, The Enchanted Wood, yes, Jess. There's a scene in my bedroom. Is that The Enchanted Wood by Enid Blyton? Because I've just started reading that with my child, my 3-year-old, and the language in it, I'm blown away by the language and how intricate it is. Anything by Anthony Brown, that's right. Well, now we have this lovely list in our group chat. Feel free to copy and paste that and use that for some of your shared reading. Thanks for sharing all that. There's a C in my bedroom, yeah. We know what you mean. Wilfred Gordon, McDonald Partridge. Chris, I have 2 copies of this and I cannot bear to get rid of one because I just love that book. Oh, and Rowan of Rin, yes. Yeah, and you can reread, that's right, chapter books in it. Perfect. What a fabulous group we have here with great ideas. Okay, moving on, editing practice. I just want to mention as well, what always strikes me is that we are such a collaborative profession. We all have such a wealth of knowledge, and sometimes just that little sharing between us, strikes ideas and develops ideas. You know, and you've got your colleagues who say, oh, I need a good book for this. What's a good book? His name is Walter by Emily Rodda. Oh, I want to read that now because I'm a huge Emily Rodda fan and I haven't actually read that one. Okay, so editing practice is explained on page 17 if you want to flick there now. So during the first workshop, I talked a bit about kind of that writing cycle approach, the process writing approach, in which you might want students to be conferencing with you. So editing practice is kind of when you want students to be able to edit independently. You want to be able to, you expect them to be able to do this away from you, and you expect them to be able to edit peers' writing as they work through this writing cycle. So they, you know, pre-writing, drafting the work, revising it, editing and publishing it. You want this to mostly be independent, and then you want your conferences to fit in wherever they need to be, that students can conference at any point in this writing cycle. If you aren't familiar with this model of writing cycle, it is very student-led. So they should be replicating what authentic writers do. And I use this model a lot in my classroom. So this is an example of what it looks like on the wall. I've even had students with their names on pegs, moving their names around. I've used it on the smartboard and had students moving their names around where they are in the writing cycle that day. It just loves making me get up, doesn't it? Okay. I often make the self and peer edit explicit in the writing cycle, so you can see that it's here, that this is something that I want them to do when they get to this point. Partner check is also something that sometimes I put in there, so they do their peer edit and then a self edit. So knowledge in how to edit is really necessary for this, and that's why I make sure I implement the writing cycle even before I begin I implement editing practice even before we talk about the writing cycle. I want my students to have completed some practice in this. So the steps here are that we provide a text with errors. Now, you can use a student text for this, one from previous years or one that you've prepared earlier. But what also is fun is to use a modelled or even jointly constructed piece of writing that you've done as a class and edit it. So if you're modelling and you make a few errors, that's great. Or if you're doing jointly constructed and as the students are writing, you know, they're putting errors in, that's also really good. I would suggest that you complete this on a paper copy for students. Don't do it on a smartboard, because I think editing, you do need that pen to paper feel that Gary Crew was talking about earlier. Like everything, it's really necessary that you model and explain what an editor does. So again, here we're probably talking about those think alouds. Be really specific here depending on what your expectations are. So for younger years as well, I have expectations that when they're editing, I want them to use 2 different coloured pencils, one for their self-edits and one for buddy edits, and I don't mind what colour they are. But I've got those really clear expectations, and they're written down as well for students to see. To formalise these self-edits, I often give the students success criteria that I showed you before, or, you know, whatever kind of feature list you might have. And this way students can work through some of those criteria and they can improve their work as they go. I'm also going to show you some different examples of these that you might use. During buddy edits, I generally expect students to be able to give each other one positive and one negative or constructive comment, and I do that from, you know, when you've got your writers. So from end of kinder all the way up to year 6, just one for each other. I mean, they might want to give more than that, and that's okay too, but generally giving more than one negative or constructive comment isn't great as a peer editor. So having the checklist with them, or whatever kind of editing checklist you use, it might be your feature list, or it might be an editing checklist like is explained in the book on page 17. That can be really assistive, as their buddy can go through checking off parts that they can see in their text, and they might actually pick up on some things that that student has missed when they've done their self-edit. Or you could have goal cards that students pick for each other. So another teacher I worked with, she had great goal cards, and on these she had things like capitals or letter reversals, like in junior years, up to things like complex sentences or, you know, direct and indirect speech. And then depending on what the student felt they needed to work on, what the other student felt they needed to work on, they would pull out kind of a goal-setting card. And then that student, when they come to conference with you, they would have highlighted where they've done that in their work, or they would highlight it for their peer as well. So goal-setting cards are another way of doing this. Make it really specific to your class though. If you're going to do those goal-setting cards, make sure you use the language that you use in your class and the concepts that you've worked on. So you might not say conjunctions, you might talk about joining words. Thirdly, the students need time to edit. Now, this shouldn't take too long. It's sometimes good while you're doing this editing practice as a class, just to give students a short amount of time, because we know students are going to work at different paces. But what is good is to stop once a few students have stopped, not everyone, because it's better to have some editors still going than many finished and just waiting for the end. Then, after you've edited as a class or individually in the class, mark the text then as a class. So you might model this whole process, and then you might get students to do it in groups and then individually, whatever works for your level of students. But I would generally make sure that they have individual editing practice, like this strategy suggests, before they're going to do it in the writing cycle. So here are some examples of different success criteria or things that I've used for editing practice. Chris talks about using 3 stars and a wish for peer conferences, which is another beautiful structure to use. If you have, yeah, that's true, Annette. So if you want to talk about editing leading towards those editorial choices, so using vocabulary, sentences, what they mean the best way, it's different than focusing on the spelling or punctuation, which is more that proofreading. Now, depending on how you're structuring your writing, you might want to use it for that proofreading, or you might want to use it as those editorial choices, just as Annette's saying. And I've done a bit of both. So for some students, they find it really difficult to look away from proofreading. So then that's what we do as our editing practice. And then you can develop that into that, you know, more editorial choices. So these are the goal setting cards that I talked about before. Just an example of what they look like. These are 4 different ones, and this was when we were goal setting around having different types of processes in our writing, so behaving, doing, thinking and saying, and the kids could pull out one that they were going to be focusing on in their writing, and then they go through their edit and they check that they had that, and then their peer could do that as well. Here's another information report success criteria, so they could then go through and check that they have those things in their work, and their peer could also check that. Another rubric style where I like to do the below, at and above, so that way we're all kind of on the spectrum. We can see what we have in our text and how we could kind of go beyond that. So this is a good way of students being able to give feedback for other students when they go, oh, their spelling's fine, like their spelling's fine, their punctuation's fine, I can't see anything wrong with them. Actually giving that student, well, they could add this or they could change this to see that there's always improvements we can be making on each other's writing. And here's another one where we've kind of got it, not quite and not at all. So again, we've got that continuum where we can see that, you know, sometimes we completely don't put things in there like using a Z form in the movement of the image. Or that it's kind of there, but maybe some things need to be moved around. And then when they've got it, so you can see actually that this kind of continuum allows students to move along it and to see that editing should feed back into their text. Okay, we're going to look at a student device text. And I want you to think about, when you look at it, what you'd put on an editing checklist. Annette's given us a few ideas there already. But if you were to use this text in your class, think about your situation. What might you, or if this was a text, sorry, to come from your class, because I know it's not going to be for all of year levels, of course, what would you suggest then as something to go on an editing checklist for your kids? Freddie's mic, or put it in the chat. Hovering there in the TARDIS amongst all the gadgets the Doctor built was a Busby, completely ordinary, its own special way, eating chocolate. What would you want to add? You can see they're writing narrative and they've got their beginning there. What would you add for an editing checklist? A sizzling start. Yeah. So you want to make sure that they've all got sizzling starts. And you might be really explicit in what that looks like. You might even have an example in your checklist. You might think about something that this person has. I actually think about kind of commas or like looking at the different clauses here. Yeah, that's got it too. And putting some of those commas. I love it when I say things when people are thinking of the same thing. You might think about like spelling might be something in there. It might be vowel sounds, yeah. This is actually something that a student has done as patterned writing from Uno's Garden. So it's a beautiful introduction to a story, but they obviously still have a bit of trouble, adding some of that descriptive language or introducing some of the characters still. The technical stuff, yeah. If this is to come from my class, then I would still have punctuation and spelling on that checklist. Medial sounds. Oh, I love it. That's really specific and perfect descriptive language. Great. So have a look at some of your students' writing and let that guide whatever your editing checklist is going to be around. Because, you know, there's a great list in the book, but you want to make it purposeful for your class. All right, our last part of this workshop is what I call adding to the mix. So I finished the first workshop with a few kind of those extras, some strategies that hopefully you'd find helpful in your everyday. Have you seen this before? I love this one. This is one of my favourite ones. And this is how I kind of want to end this workshop with as well. Some of my favourite strategies that can just be kind of added into planning as you need them, but they may not be daily or even weekly practices depending on your class. They're just sometimes some of those fun assistive things to use. So the first one in this area is called choral reading, and this is explained on page 12. You might be really familiar with choral reading, or you might have never heard of it before. And I must say that I had never heard of this strategy before, finding it in the book. And then another colleague of mine was talking about a choral reading episode that she'd done at her school. And I was like, what is this? This sounds amazing. I've got to get into this. And it's one of those strategies that it really is a performance strategy. Like that's what the end goal is to perform. But it's really great also to develop students' awareness of text, their structure, and it assists their fluency. You can use it with your rereading as well, because students will learn that reading aloud is actually a thoughtful process in which they kind of need to tap into the rhythm or the pattern of a text. It's also a very collaborative strategy. And fire is beautiful. You don't need to look at it now. I'm going to look at a page in a minute, but you can if you want to. It's a collaborative strategy. So again, it's something that you do as a whole class, and it develops this class collaboration where you sit down and you talk about a text and talk about how you could read this better. So the steps here are, firstly, choose a divisible text. I would suggest, and I think the book does as well, choosing something that has a rhythm or a pattern to it. And a lot of the texts that you actually mentioned before as books to reread, books for shared reading would be perfect for this. I often use kind of poetic texts. So that Natural Disaster series, the fire one here, by Jackie French and Bruce Watley, are beautiful for choral reading pieces. They probably suit upper primary, but you could do them with lower as well. Some of the themes might be a bit scary for your kids, depending on where you live in Australia and what you've already gone through. But for a more light-hearted approach, any kind of poetry. Yeah, that's right. I like using Sister Madge's Book of Nuns, and I've used this for choral reading. It's hilarious if you haven't seen it. It's an older publication by Craig Smith. And, yeah, beautiful poems in there, hilarious poems, bit of fun. So this strategy lends itself really well to narrative, although your choral reading will be more successful because you're telling a story through it. You want to be able, that choral reading, to tell some kind of story. So there are some suggestions in the book as well of different choral reading texts that you should use, but anything poetry with a pattern. I love that fire book. Okay. I see, sorry, I'm just noticing what people are writing in the chat there. So the second step is to read that text to the class so they comprehend it, they can listen for any pattern or rhythm in it. You really want them to open their ears up to tune into the pattern and rhythm while you read it. Tell them that they need to listen with intention of what you'll be doing next. Explain to them what you'll be doing next so they know how to listen. So if we were to read this to a group, how could we make it come alive? In what parts would we all read? Would we whisper some parts? Would we yell some parts? And then the third step is when it really becomes collaborative. So have students suggest ideas for the reading. Start very generally like, okay, are there any parts in which we should all read? Highlight these and then become more specific about who will read what and how they might read it. You could even divide the group up and get them each to work on their part of the reading and then put it back together. Have some kind of system to mark the text for all students. And I actually usually use this on the smartboard or on my computer so I can be highlighting and putting in the notes as we work through it. And then each student has a similar copy. The fourth step is to rehearse, and I would suggest to even record the reading. This will allow students to self-evaluate their reading and how they might want to improve it. I'm devastated that I can't find my choral reading of Fire that I did with this group of students because it was just incredible. It's such a performance strategy, so it makes sense that this strategy would be something that would be displayed at a school assembly, and yes, I've used it at school assemblies. But you know, if it's too hard to do that at this point in the year for you and your class, it could also be shared on school Facebook page as an audio file. It could be shared on a website or even on a school podcast or even over the school PA system. How great would that be if you just had a takeover of the PA system and had a choral reading? So do record it, get students to think about that reading and, you know, practice and rehearse it. Okay, so the next activity might not work because everyone's been really shy on their microphones this evening. But what I thought we could try to do, and I don't know if it'll even work, because you guys are the first ones to do this second workshop, you're kind of my guinea pig bunch. So if anyone does want to try to do this with me, that would be great. Feel free to say, yeah, sure, in the chat now. Otherwise, oh no, I'm feeling too shy, Libby. I thought that we could try having, oh yay, thanks Stephanie. I thought we could try having a bit of a choral reading. I don't know if it'll work that we can all talk at once. I think what'll happen is your mics will cut each other out, but we can still give it a good shot. Awesome. Now I did put in here anyone from Tasmania, anyone from Queensland, anyone from New South Wales. But I reckon what we do is, because I don't think we've got anyone from Queensland, do we? Oh, yes. Okay. And we've got someone from Tasmania and we've got people from New South Wales. Yes. Okay. Beautiful. All right. So hopefully we have readers from each part. I'm going to read through it firstly, how I would read it. And then we're going to try. I'm really hopeful to read through it together. It might be a complete failure, and that's okay because this can also happen. I've got someone from Taz, yay! All right. If you're not from any of those states and you want to just join a state, you know, come on ACT, let's just pretend we're in New South Wales again. That's fine too. So this is how I'd read it. You don't need to join in yet. I'm going to read it how I'd read it. One small spark brought fire awake, winding like a small black snake. Fire flickered, fire crept. So we're going to do that one like fire flickered, fire crept. Flame snickered, bushfire leapt. Air too thick with ash to see. Dry winds lash, bushfire see. And then really like time to run, time to flee. Maybe if I use my hand as well as like a way of us doing this together. Okay, are you ready? Yep. I'm going to start, then Taz, then all, then Queensland, then me, then anyone from New South Wales, then all. So turn on your mics. I'll give you a moment to do that. Yep. Turn them on. Brilliant. Okay. Let's give it. One small spark, fire awake.
Winding like a small black snake.
Fire
flickered.
Flame snickered. Bushfire leapt.
Air too thick with ash to see.
Dry winds lash, bushfire see.
Time to run. Time to flee. That's really thank you guys. You're all in the recording now as well. I'm so impressed that worked in some respect. I mean, there was a bit of, overlap because we're all on different times, but that kind of worked. Well done, us. So lots of fun. And as we're getting to the end of the year as well, and I know performance pieces are coming up for all of you, I think this is a great strategy to have under your belt. So moving on now, we're going to look at storyboards next. So storyboards are described in a really interesting way in this book, and they're described on page 59. They're described as one kind of structured strategy that you'd really only use for one purpose, but I would suggest that actually it's a very flexible strategy. They are really great to use to show the structure of narrative, and I talked about how I used that previously in my classes. But using storyboards can help students to develop their story so they only insert important details, that they think about each part of their story before they go to write it, and that each part of their story serves a purpose. So for all our students who like to insert every family member's name into stories and then never include them again, it can actually help students to see that process and actually, we can cut out that part, or we can add this part. It then translates into students using storyboards to make their own narratives and to ensure that all those details serve the purpose of their story. Storyboards are an excellent assessment of visual literacy as well though, and this is how I've used them most recently, where I've had students develop storyboards after watching something with moving images in it, and it allows me to see what students tune into when they're watching moving images. I can see what parts of the image they're tuning into, so how they comprehend what they're seeing. It can also help students pick apart visual narratives and critique these, like we spoke about in the first workshop. So, I talked about how I'd gotten students to critique Rabbit Proof Fence and the film version of it, or a part of it. So by putting that into a storyboard and actually writing their critique underneath each frame that they draw, you can actually see how students can kind of critically analyse these visual texts. But they're also excellent for planning, and I've used them for planning kind of anything that has movement in it, so drama or dance, and I've used them recently in planning actually Scratch or coding presentations. So if you're not familiar with Scratch, give it a quick Google. It's a coding website where students can develop their own code, and I got students to use Scratch to develop information reports. So they had little presenters presenting information, and then they had images coming up. And because there was a lot of movement in there, limited text, storyboards actually worked wonders for that. So I think storyboards are one of those strategies that you can actually use for a range of purposes. And now that I've said all that, let's have a look at some of these steps and have a pen ready to write down in some of these suggestions that I'm going to make here, and any suggestions as well that we have on the chat. So the first is to choose a text, and they assume here that you're going to use it for narrative structure, so we'll go with that for now. But start with something your students already know when you're going to show them how to use a storyboard. It might be a text that you've used for your read aloud or for your shared reading, or you might use it for that short film that you watched that you're going to do some critical analysis on. In the second step, explain that storyboards have come from this visual storytelling background. So tell them that, storyboards are used to create movies, to create films. And they're used to depict that movement in a 2D form. You could model how you'd ensure that there's overlap between the frames. So the story doesn't just jump from one scene to another. There's always some kind of overlap between the scenes that I can see it's moving to the next part. So the characters are going to be similar. The settings might be similar between the frames, and they might only change, once or twice. And I need some way to be able to note this. You talk about the fact that it doesn't have to be detailed, that it can be really quite a quick sketch, and that it isn't word heavy, that there isn't much text to it. So then next you model and you jointly construct a storyboard. And here I'd suggest that you construct at least the first and the second box or second frame, and then you allow students to join in. So never assume that students are on board and know what they have to do unless you've modelled before. So model first and then do the jointly construct. The fourth step here is to then construct a feature list that we talked about before, where you talk about what needs to be included, the images that you might be using, that there needs to be images, that there needs to be text, all that stuff that you've already modelled and explained. Put that together in a feature list. Then step 5 is that the students will create storyboards. And this might happen that day, or it might happen a few days later. And it doesn't have to be on paper with pen, even though we know that that is a great form of writing and creating. There are also so many digital tools for storyboards now, so I highly encourage you to check some of these out. They can be really engaging for our disengaged writers, and I have used them for some of my more disengaged writers in the past, especially because they can start with the visual and then they can add the text. You might have a purpose, though, for wanting your students to explore their skills as visual creators, where you want them to use little or limited text, and I think that the digital form can sometimes be really useful for this. So when I've used this as a planning tool, they talk about just having 8 frames. I would actually suggest having multiple copies of storyboards printed out back to back. And there's just a huge pile of them there. They can take as many as they need, and then they can cross out the frames that they don't need. And you'll see a few examples of my students' storyboards next. Finally, we use the storyboard in some way. So just like any strategy, we don't do it for the sake of doing it. We're using it as a launchpad for writing or creating, or as a response to reflect on something with. So I'm going to just share a link with you. And if there's time at the end, we might go back and have a look at this link. And this is an online storyboard creator that I like. It's free use. It's called Storyboard That. It does have limited, images and backgrounds that you can use. So there's, limitations in it. But I have found it really useful because it's something that students can use quite easily to tell stories quite quickly with. And my activity here was just that you have a go creating a storyboard. But we're going to leave that for now.
Oh, okay, how's your being going?
And I'm going to just show you, here are some examples of storyboards that my students have created. So you can see, and this was actually a final storyboard for this student scratch that they were doing. They have their presenter there, their presenter then with their house, their presenter. So they had that overlap that I really wanted them to have. They don't have a lot of text, but you can see that this student, they didn't need all 8 boxes to create their storyboard, whereas this student, they used the entire storyboard and then actually went on to the back as well, because they were being a bit more detailed about the transitions they wanted between them. So having multiple boxes there and multiple copies can be really useful when you're doing storyboards. Okay, and on to our last strategy, which is word sorts. So we've talked a lot about different strategies this evening and in the first workshop. And during the first workshop, some participants asked about spelling and how it fits into all this. Well, spelling is a skill that should be developed in writing and from reading. And the words that you are studying should come from your reading and writing class. So word sorts are one of those strategies that is great to have up your sleeve if you want that spelling program that is text-rich and authentic and comes from your reading and writing. I've used word sorts in varying degrees across different year levels. I found them particularly useful in junior years when I'm trying to get kids to tune into some patterns of words. And I've used a variation in senior years when my students are focusing more on word origins, etymology, and root words. So I've left 2 links there for you as well to have a look at. The Spellforbet site is one that has lists of words around different spelling patterns and sound patterns, and it's an Australian website and it's free, which is awesome. So rather than using American-based word lists where actually our pronunciation of different sounds is a little bit different, this is an Australian list. I often use it kind of as a backup if students are locating words and I'm like, oh, is that to do with that same sound pattern, or are we just making it? So you can go and have a look at these lists and see some of the sound patterns in there. When I'm talking about etymology and we're talking about kind of inquiring into words and word roots and using them in our word sorts, the Etymology Online website is just absolute gold. I love it, and it's like a nerd burger moment as well if you want to go and check out the etymology of some of your favourite words, where they've come from, and it talks about the history, and kids love it as well when you go into that one. So this book really describes devising your own list of words, which I think is really refreshing, because I've seen word sorts marketed a lot of the time in Words Their Way programs, and we use B spelling a lot in the ACT if you're familiar with either of those programs. So when you're making a word sort, you're trying to make it as contextualised as possible. I've taken words from books that we're reading in class, from topic areas that we're studying at that moment, like, if we're looking at something in geometry or maths or history or science even, we're using some of the language from those areas for our word sorts. You can be using those words that you already have it used in your classroom, because this way you don't actually need to make sure that students understand what those words mean. They're already familiar with the language and pronunciation of each if they come from shared text. If you're looking for words on a particular letter or sound pattern, I'd highly recommend, I've already talked about that Spellforbet site. And it's really important to complete a jointly constructed word sort. So you need to model your thinking that occurs when you're sorting the words. So make notes of what you're trying to say again. When you model, have an open sort as well as closed ones, where you have those clearly defined boundaries. Okay, words that begin with this, words that begin with this, or words that sound like this. That's a closed sort when you've got those headings or those areas that you want to sort into. An open sort is just having those words there and saying, what do you notice about these words? How could we sort these? What similarities do they have? I also find having like an oddball or words that don't fit category can be really helpful as well for students when they're kind of going, I don't know where that goes. They've always got that oddball area. After you've modelled and jointly constructed enough word sorts, you give your students some sets of words to sort, and you ensure they have some open and closed sorts. Allow students to find their own words from their text as well. That's really rich activity. And sharing those word sorts then can be a lot of fun. Students can see how groups of words could be sorted in a variety of ways if they all have the same list, or they could see how their peers are doing different things if they have different lists. And it adds this extra element of spelling inquiry into the strategy. I was going to share a video from Dr. Tessa DeFern's website. I will, though, put the link in our chat, though. If you want to have a look at it, she goes through actually how a student would go from finding those words, developing their own word sorts, sorting the words, and then where she'd take it next. And I think it's a really concise way of looking at word sorts. It's a free video that you can access in there as well. I was going to talk about, for example, how could these words be sorted? We could start with an open word sort and say, what do you notice in them? Or I could say to you, I want you to sort them using syllables. I want you now to sort them with the different spelling of that sound, grapheme. Oh, I want you to sort them into parts of speech. So looking at our verbs and our nouns, or our processes and our participants here. So up to you how you use those word sorts, and you could use the same word sort in multiple ways. Well, look at that. I've run over, or just on time. Like the first workshop, I always think it's really important that you have one takeaway or one goal or something from this evening that you can take with you and use in your classroom tomorrow, be it success criteria, be it author studies, be it choral reading, be it storyboards, word sorts, modelled writing, whatever you think you would use. Have a takeaway, have a goal, have something that you can take from this evening. I can stay. Got any questions? So if you had some in the chat, or you're welcome to email me as well if you have any questions. My email I'm just putting in the chat now about any of the strategies that we've gone over, or even some of the ones that we haven't gone over this evening. There's my email. So I truly hope that the strategies in this book have opened up your eyes to different ways of doing things in your classroom, because I know that there are so many roadblocks in good teaching. There are tests, there are programs, administrators, parents, and all the other voices that tell us to do things one way or another way. And I highly encourage and hope for all of you that although you may have to listen to these voices, there is space for change in our profession and positive change in the way in which we teach that allow our students in our classrooms to blossom. Have a wonderful end to the year, and I hope I see you at other ALEA events. It's been wonderful seeing some of you again and seeing some faces new. Oh, I'm just going to end our share. Stop share. And I'm just going to stop our recording for now.